Okay. Okay. All right. So let's get this started. I'm really excited for this today. I'm so excited for this current quarter of what we're exploring with Woi Magazine. And I'm so excited to have Edwidge Danticat with us. It's an honor, it's a pleasure. And we do these live streams once a quarter. And the point is that we don't want way content to just be things that we post. We want it to also to be like living dynamic things that the community can engage with and contribute to. And what better way to do that via a video chat? um, so yeah, you want to tell them a little bit about the quarter, Valerie?
Right. So this quarter, we really wanted to talk about what it means to keep Haitian memory, Haitian culture alive. And it's been something that Tally and I have been really thinking and talking about for months now. And so, especially as members of the diaspora, we really wanted to explore, like, how do we keep our culture alive? How do we keep our language alive? How do we keep our memories alive? What is memory? What memories are stable? So it only makes sense that we would bring along Edwidge, who has done a marvelous job in her career in talking about Haitian identity and the diversity of it across the diaspora. I remember when I was little and I read Breath, Eyes, Memory, and finally seeing myself in a book for the first time. And while I couldn't relate to everything the protagonist went through, I still saw some of the same struggles that me and my cousins and my friends were going through. So that's what we're trying to explore this quarter. And so in addition to this void chat, we'll have pieces from different people exploring different angles of this topic. And so tonight, our hope with you, Edwidge, is to explore how this narrative, how these topics and themes show up in your work.
Thank you. And merci un peu, Lunaris Moon. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of your work at Woi and everything you all do in the world. So thank you for having me.
Of course.
So I'm sure everyone watching knows who Edwidge is, but even still, I'm going to read a bit of a bio. So Edwidge Danticat is a writer whose works examine our rich and complex history as Haitians, as well as the diversity, grief, loss, and identity that comes with the immigrant experience. Whether it's through stories uncovering lost histories like the farming of bones, or the complicated intricacies of womanhood like Breath, Eyes, Memory, Edwidge provides us with engaging stories, reminding us of the power of human survival, tenacity, love, and growth. She holds a BA from Barnard College and an MFA from Brown University. Edwidge has been awarded numerous honors, including the MacArthur Fellows Grant, the Langston Hughes Medal, and the National Books Critics Circle Award. And most importantly, she's my favorite author. So
exactly.
Thank you.
Yes, welcome.
Thank you.
So today, let's try to flow in whatever language we'd like to. We want to keep this as at home and relaxed as possible.
Yep.
And to those watching, we are keeping an eye for your comments. And if we have time, we can ask questions at the end. If you put them in the comments, but also we want to see that you're watching and see what you're saying. So keep the comments coming. All right. So I'm going to go into the first question.
Okay.
So do you think the movement of Haitians to the USA, Canada, France, etc., that it shapes our history in a certain way?
Most certainly, we've had so many different kinds of migrations, starting, pre-revolution from Saint-Domingue with with the soldiers who came to Savannah, Georgia, going through during the first beginning of the 20th century with migrations to Cuba for sugarcane and and then to the DR, and then which became like a forced migration throughout the Duvalier dictatorship, and the 1980s, 1990s. I think a lot of people, we forget that before Guantanamo was a place where where people who they considered terrorists were imprisoned. Haitians were imprisoned there, and then these more recent migrations to Brazil, to Chile, and the southern border now. So our story is, as it's developed over the centuries, is a story of migration. And the irony of that too is that Haiti was considered a place where people wanted to migrate to.
Yeah.
Post-independence, where you had all these, from Boyer, Geffra, Dessalines, who when after our independence said, like, if anybody who made it on that land, who was indigenous, who was African descent, could be a citizen of Haiti, and land was allotted. And there's a wonderful novel written by an African American novelist, Caitlin Greenidge, called Liberté, where she talks about that from an African American perspective of someone who goes to Haiti because there's a beacon. There's a debate about people who of African descent who want to stay here, and others who saw this big light in Haiti. So I think when we talk about our migration too, it's important to also talk about what we represented to migrants, and even through the Harlem Renaissance, like intellectuals who felt like they had to make a trip to Haiti, from Zora Neale Hurston to Catherine Dunham and Langston Hughes to the rest. So, but migration is definitely a part of our DNA now, because most people, we know the stories of the remittances and what that migration has meant, and what's motivated it too is that most people who leave have someone back that they're sending money to.
Yeah.
Certainly, like, each of us has a migration story. So I think in a way it's defined certainly who we are, but also how we dream in terms of, like, young people with their relationship to migration, and what that means to the country, longhand. I left one other migration that's really fascinating. My middle school, junior high school teacher, Mr. Dusek, had migrated to the Congo when, like,
Wow.
Raoul Peck and those families who also were Haitians who went to the Congo, to Ghana, and helped them post-independence. So
Right.
there's a very long and fascinating history of Haitian migration, certainly.
Right. And it kind of like allows us to become part of other people's histories, right?
Yes,
Right.
yeah. I remember having, Amaata Ado, who's the writer from Ghana. I remember talking to her about Félix Maurice Leroy, the poet, and she was like, "No, he's mine." I was like, "No, he's mine." She said, because he started the National Theater in Ghana, and they claim him.
Wow.
I had to reclaim or decide to share with her.
We'll share.
Yeah.
We're always talking about that. We're like, do we share right now or do we gatekeep?
We should share. We should share because we're, Pan-Africanists.
Yes, ma'am.
I think it's so interesting that you mentioned people wanting to come to Haiti, and because one of my best friends, she's Trinidadian, and at one point her grandfather lived in Haiti, and she said till the day he died, he talked about like how Haiti was the only place a Black man could be free, and like if he had money in his pocket, it was his and it did not belong to anybody else's. So you just brought that memory up, and I hope she's watching. I think she'll be excited that I mentioned that to you.
I think it's so important for us to remember that too, because that's another way of sort of counting the negativity. And even with migration to the US, I always tell people, before we came here, they came to us. Like,
Exactly.
There was that very lengthy occupation that reshaped our borders, and so it's all so very connected.
It is.
Yeah. I have so many thoughts, but my sister, I'm gonna brace I'm gonna limit myself. My sister and I, we talk about migration sometimes, and we talk about like the ways we're disconnected from Haiti and things we don't know how to do, or I'll be like, well, I'm about It's like, well, we're Americanized. And so we always refer to it as the things we lost in the fire. We always say, another thing we lost in the fire. And I mean, we gained a lot of things in the fire, right? If we look at, where my father was like socioeconomically as a child to where I am now because of the fact that we immigrated, it's a world of a difference, right? But there's a number of things we lose tangibly, abstract and concrete. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about like how we could ever count or reflect on the things we lose and the fact that we had to immigrate because we were fleeing, living conditions that weren't the best.
I mean, we have to think, when I think of, first of all, the things, I think of the people we lost, right? Because there was that whole period. And when I was writing Kikak and writing Children of the Sea, I was living in Providence, and there were so many people who were coming. It was the 1990s after the coup d'etat against President Aristide, and so many people were coming by boat, and we were never sure how many people we lost and doing those journeys, and how many people we lost coming across to the southern border from Brazil through all those countries for all those hundreds of miles. So I think of those losses, and then I think it always comes up in sort of like what could have been, right? You think of what could have been, and all that's been offered to other people, and all that's serviced other countries in which we're still neglected and mistreated, and helping build other places, right? And in some cases where we're still kicked out of. So of course that's a very painful thing. But I'll just like a little personal thing and what is gained. My mother was with me here in Miami when she was sick with cancer and dying, and everyone we came across was Haitian. And so one day she came out of a procedure, and she was talking to, she was a little doozy still from the anesthesia, and she said to the Haitian men, kounya m kompren pou ki sa nou tout la, c'est pou nou ka pran soin yon lot, like, right? And so in that moment, I thought, there's still a way that we are taking care of each other here, because in some cases, especially in areas like, with very high poverty rates, in places like Miami with a lot of new arrivals, we're still taking care of each other here. But of course, what we lose is the physicality, the day-to-day, what might have been, because we don't really know what might have been. We don't really know what we could have created together fully if we haven't had all these, the interventions, the imperialism, all that's actually led to the political situations we've had, and that's led to the migrations.
Yeah.
So one question that I have for you, it comes from even more conversations I've been having, not just with Tali, but also other folks. I don't know if you know, but there's like this new app called Clubhouse, and I see Oakland, for themselves at this point. And so often when I go on there, the same conversation I'm hearing is that a lot of, I would say, like Haitian millennials and those of the younger generation, they feel like they just don't belong anywhere. And it's not just like, I think language and what Tali said about, things being lost in immigration and migration is cause of that partly. But they really do feel like they're caught in two worlds. And I think so much of what we try to do here at WOI is we're trying to reconcile the two cultures. We're trying to make sure like we're building this bridge where it doesn't matter where you're from, you're going to have some kind of update as to what's happening back home. And fortunately for us, we do get a lot of feedback that people are like, outside of like my mom's church, this is the only place I can feel connected to beauty and feel like I'm part of something greater. And so I wanted to ask you, is this the case with your art? And do you feel like this is a running theme among immigrant artists of building a bridge that kind of links these worlds and kind of brings people who may feel, okay, like I'm a bit outside here. I think we all know, like sometimes when you go back to Haiti, toujours bien un monde qui est blanc, And so like, do you feel like that's part of why you do what you do, basically, is to kind of build this community, as such as your mother said.
Well, it's really another thing my mother used to say too, like in my house, if we said something in Creole she didn't quite grasp, she would say "sablandi."
Yes.
And then for us, it was like a clue to like rephrase what we had said. But I think that feeling of like the culture clash and the not feeling like you belong is normal. I have friends from all over, who, based on the age they come from, it's that feeling of uneasiness is normal. That feeling of like, when you're here, you're Haitian. When you're in Haiti, you're American. Like two Haitian for here, two American for there. You could fill in the country, really. The thing is, I see like Haitian kids are very attached to, young people are very attached to an idea and an ideal of Haiti. And it's in a way miraculous because we all a lot of us grew up in these types of homes where our parents worshipped Haiti. They worshipped Haiti that they knew. They talk about how cheap rice was at a certain point, even though the dictatorship was going on. They have this ideal. And then at the same time, you say, oh, I want to go there. Like, oh, not now. It's not the right time. And I can't tell you, I would run into, when I was going to Haiti, I would run into some kid in the airport whose parents I know, and there's like, and then they were going. That's when you could go. A bus was picking them up, and they were going to, I forget, the Cameroon or something, with a spring break group. That's how they felt like they're going, because they didn't feel like going to Port-au-Prince and sitting in their aunt's living room for 3 days. So they took matters into their own hands and found groups that they could go to and see. So I think, but that there's still an attachment, like that their Flag Day. But I think we have to, and the work you're doing is so important, and that others are doing too, is to get us past that surface.
Yeah.
Right. That we're not just Diapwa, we're not just Compa, we're not just that flag that you wear like around your head, like that there's depth. And I've had that same conversation with I have a sister-in-law who's Jamaican, with Jamaicans back home and Jamaicans here, and they have the same pool where they're like, oh, the people, they had the same situation in terms of like wanting people to go a little bit deeper beyond their Haitian heritage, and by their happy Haitian heritage, want the pride, right? To go deeper and to keep Haiti close all the time. So I think what you're doing is a great part of that, because you talk about the difficulties, you talk about the beauty, you talk about the culture, and which the students can, the young people can get here. And there's a group here, I think Avancer Ensemble, where there's these dialogues, and I think that needs to happen more, of young people in Haiti, like young cultural groups in Haiti. I think there's one that who's on right now with us, groups here having conversation with young people here based on their interests, like that. I think that would be very, very, very important. But there's also a dismissive element in our culture about when people suddenly, I had with elders in my own family, that I think is sometimes discouraging to young people. And then our job is to, your job is to push back and say, help me understand, right? Explique, bum detail. And then that way there's at least a conversation. So in my work, what I was really, for me, when I got here at age 12, and I went to the Brooklyn Public Library and I started reading all these Haitian novels. I was reading to go home. I was reading to put myself back in Haiti in some way. And so that's, then, Toni Morrison says, if there's a book you want to read that hasn't been written yet, you write it.
Yeah.
So that's really, I started writing as a kind of a place of preservation for me. There's so many things that I didn't want to forget. And, Danny Laferriere talks about his work being one long autobiography. I mean, I wouldn't say autobiography for myself, but I see it as one long story. just kind of almost an archival project, both fiction and nonfiction, so that even for myself, if I'm blessed enough to live to be 80 years old, I can go back and say, oh, this is the journey that I've been on these last years with people who, were kind enough to also read me.
Yeah. I think when I listen to any fellow artist talk about their art, and like they're like, yeah, I'm trying to make sense of the world. I'm trying to make sense of these cultures that affect me. I want to reconnect to Creole. I want to reconnect to Haiti. It's like we're all out here figuring out the same thing.
Yes, and I think we should celebrate that. I think we should celebrate that, and even and I love these. There's these excavation project I see some of like people do, and especially in song, right? Going back to sing Toto Vicente, going back to sing like Martin Jean-Claude, and going back to like looking at what came before you, right? I think that's very powerful. And then putting
there's this like archival thing that's happening in music. I'm thinking of like Nathalie Joachim, Lena Mikala, like those girls are very much like in the diaspora and like bringing like historical Haiti into their art. It's awesome. It's cool.
And I think it's amazing because I think it's so important to be like, this is yours too. I mean, as much as Nina Simone or as much as, like Ella Fitzgerald, this is also yours and it's unique to you. And it's a way that you can even talk across generations. Your parents will recognize this. And then you're introducing it to your peers or the generation after you. I think that's a really very powerful, project, certainly.
Yeah, you say something along those lines in Creating Dangerously, where you're like, as an immigrant artist, like having the audacity to take back home as yours and feeling enough ownership of Haiti to write about Haiti, even if you're not in Haiti. I remember reading that when it came out and being like, it was like, I grew up in Haiti. I moved here at 17 and I still was like, I don't know if I'm allowed to,
I know that, that issue of permission. I think when I was younger, people would sometimes say like, initially that's the thing too, like when Breath Eyes Memory came out, a lot of people were very angry with me. And ultimately, because they thought it's like, I thought I was writing a singular story about one family. They're like, but I agree that there were people who'd be like, oh, which is valid, right? But I think that's on the reader because
that's their fault.
The way they make like anthropology, sociology, and all, like they generalize our work in a way that you're denied a singular experience, right? So I felt very terrible about that, but also that's liberating in that you realize, like as an artist, it's freeing when you realize I'm not going to be everybody's cup of tea. I'm not going to be everybody's not going to like what I do, but I'm still going to try to tell. So, but as an immigrant, it's like the next generation. I see so many people who are like, I want to write about this, but I'm worried that I'm too distant. So I'm like, the Blancs are not asking your permission to write about this. Why, like, right? They're doing it, so at least you should try it. So
don't wait for permission.
Yes, exactly.
They just walk in and do whatever.
So like, what should stop you? I mean, it's kind of like, Gina, at least we need new narratives and like that continuity of narratives, you're so much part of it. And it doesn't have to be about like the day-to-day, but it could be about your own experience as part of the sort of the continuity of these stories. So I think a lot of young artists, like you just have to, they're afraid of that, like that criticism. And I remember that one of the other things that with Breath Eyes Memory, people would say, initially, like someone, I remember something like they said, you're so inauthentic. And I said, yes, I'm the most inauthentic person you will ever meet in terms of this experience, but I'm going to try to do my best to tell this story. Like, not me inauthentic, but the story is inauthentic. And I'm just like, there's, I'm not trying to tell every story. So that I think you just kind of have to be like, just mettre femme sous, as my mother would say. Mettez moun sous.
Exactly.
To be gender neutral. I think Haiti, by the way, was ahead in the gender neutral thing. It's like,
oh yeah, I'm always saying that. Like, I love Creole because you have the option of just saying li,
Oh, I know. I said, like, sometimes I have my pronouns she, her, li.
Yeah, it's in all my bios, she, her, li. Yeah.
Wait, I'm gonna do that. Yeah. Oh my God. I
love that about Creole. Creole is a okay, I'm not gonna go on my Creole tangent.
I actually was about to go on the Creole tangent because when Naomi is Creole bagay, and I think Tally and I we could talk forever about Creole, like the preservation of it.
Like, I'll tell you how many things that made me think I would say I'm a bit of a Haiti supremacist. I'm like, I need to dial it back, but like Creole is amazing. But we have a later question about Creole, so we can do that then.
We'll get to that.
I actually went to an American school when I was in Haiti. It's just funny. And I read Breath Eyes Memory just as my own, personal reading. And I was living in Haiti at the time. So it was very much like like reading about the diaspora experience, And then I moved here my 12th grade year. And it's so funny because I moved here my 12th grade year and I had a Black American English teacher and we read Breath Eyes Memory for literature class in 12th grade. And I'd already read it on my own, but I was like, it was my first time reading a Haitian author as required reading, even though I went to school in Haiti.
Wow. What year was that? What
2006, 2005.
Okay. But in the American school, and because it was an American school that
we read Mark Twain. We read, we read Huck Finn and Great Expectations, and you know what I mean. But I had to go to Philadelphia to read a Haitian. Like, we read, excerpts of things, but like my first book as the required reading for my literature class was when I moved to Philadelphia and had a Black American English teacher. I just wanted to give that anecdote really quickly.
Wow. Yeah. No, I think it probably, between your experience and mine, I'm sure there was more, I left Haiti when I was 12, so I left après certificat, m'étais passé certificat. But I didn't read Haitian authors either, which was, but that was 1981. Right. I'm sure that, I know for a fact that it's changed some, but it made me so thirsty for Haitian writing when I got here, though. It really was. That's when I started reading like Daniel Laferrière, Gigi Dominique, and what they had they had a little section at the Brooklyn Public Library. It was like Livre Haïtien, one shelf, and that in the 1980s. So I remember reading through that. That's when I read Gouverneur de la Rousseau, I read Jacques-Stéphane Alexis. I just went through.
Right. Awesome. So I know that there are certain stories in Haitian history that your book, Haitian History and Present, that your books made very real for me. For example, the Parsley massacres were it wasn't the first time I had heard of it reading, because my grandfather, growing up, used to make us practice saying Perehil.
Oh, wow.
I guess he used to be like, say it again, Perehil. And we're he's like, nope, you're not rolling your R's enough. And I mean, looking back, I'm realizing my grandfather lived near the border, and I'm guessing he met survivors. I don't know, but that was that's what I knew of the massacre. And then I read Farming of Bones, and it made it so much more real. I'm like, this is what Papi the was always talking about, was making, he would make us practice. And and then your Brother, I'm Dying. Oh my God. There were so many lines of it that I related to so much, because it spoke of an era in Haiti right before I was sent to live here, and a really scary time. There's an echo, and I'm not sure if it's because of me.
I'll mute.
Okay. Yeah. And yes. So my point is, sorry. I remember last year there was a piece that came out about ICE and how Part of what makes us so, part of a little bit of a disappointment about all the outrage around ICE recently is that we've been ignoring all the violence, medical violence that already existed in ICE. And I had to sit with that. And I was like, man, I read Brother, I'm Dying, So like, what about, like, what happened that allowed me to like revisit ICE as if it was like this newly violent place, when people like you were making those stories very real and bringing them right to my home and bringing it right to our consciousness. And I'm realizing that, I'm wondering if there was like, if you felt a sort of responsibility to make these stories realer to people like us, because these are our stories, but it's very easy for stories to become like these legends or like these like abstract far off things. And so I'm wondering about if you felt like a sense of responsibility to make those stories realer, these histories.
Yeah. We started talking about migration, and there's so many painful stories in this experience of migration. I mean, there's the stories of the boats, but when I came here in the 1980s to New York, my dad, who was a deacon in a church in New York, used to take me with some other people from the church to Brooklyn Navy Yard, where people who had come by boat were detained. And the way sort of the circularity of evil works, that Rudy Giuliani was assistant district attorney and went to Haiti to meet with Jean-Claude and to be like, oh no, they have no fear of persecution. He told me, right? And people were detained in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. They were being detained here in Chrome. And there was a phenomenon called gynos. I'm going to get it wrong, but it was a phenomenon where the men were growing breast because they were given, one of the things they were given as lotion was like this really like, it was like a tick killer for animals. I forget what it's called. And people were putting that on they're giving them that to put on their bodies every day. You had the people in Guantanamo, you had Yolande Jean's hunger strike. So it's, even before ICE existed, it was horrible, it was horrible to us because there was always a very particular immigration policy for Haitians, especially in contrast to Cubans.
Yeah.
So I remember I was working in New York for filmmaker named Jonathan Demme, and we were always advocating, we would get like all the celebrities to write letters for Guantanamo. Suzanne Sarandon read Yolande Jean's final letter to her children because she was willing to die on Guantanamo so that Haitians could be released from there. So this is ongoing. It's so when my uncle, Brother, I'm Dying is about my uncle who was living in Bel Air. He was one of the person in our family, the one person who was like, I'm not going anywhere. He had spent 50 years in Bel Air. He had a clinic there. He had a church. He had work that he was doing in the community. And then, so when there was the UN came into Bel Air and shot at people in the neighborhood from the roof of his church, and the folks in the neighborhood assumed that he had given permission, and he had turned against him. He had to flee. He had been coming here for 30 years, and when he got to Miami, he asked for, he said, I'm going to stay more than the 30 days I usually stay in. He asked for asylum. He's 81 years old and had cancer. He was detained, his medication was taken away, and he died about 5 days later, chained to a hospital bed in the prison ward of the local hospital. So, and the funny thing is, I mean, the not funny, but interesting thing was that all throughout the years, from the time my dad had taken me to Brooklyn Navy Yard, I had been like seeing very different forms of immigration detention. There were hotels here where you can walk in and there would be like 6 families, like with children, and there was a guard outside because if they ran out of space, they would rent hotel rooms and cram people there. And there was a guard in the hallway of the hotel and babies, like people with babies inside. So it's, these things have existed for a very long time. I think part of also, it's very hard to find, I think in our community, we see it sometimes, people who've survived them see it as a thing of shame. Like it's not something they're going to tell. And when I was telling my uncle's story, people, you know, I was shamed by some people. They're like, oh, so go écrivain, ou bagay ki jan sa fait rive, tonton, you know, and not fully understanding, I guess, the insidiousness of and then I kept meeting other families, people who, you know, not necessarily from Haiti, but people who like need a wheelchair and are crawling in the detention place to get around. And so it predates ICE, which happened, I think, post 9/11, but it's, you know, the horror continues as we have seen. You know?
Yeah.
So I remember when I read that book, it reminded me, one, how so much of this has been, I don't want to say normalized in our communities, but I feel like so much of what we're seeing now with conversations around immigrants is so delayed, because if you grew up in a Haitian American community, like, you know stories.
Yeah.
One story I told at work, because we were working with a client who was working on immigration reform, and because I could see like all these people were just like so removed from the issue. And I was like, look, I remember when my father was turning, like, I don't know, he was probably turning 45, he got a call. And ironically, my father's birthday is the 4th of July from the US government. And they were like, you know, happy birthday, Marcel. We are going to drop off your cousin, his wife and their baby at your house in 30 minutes. And they had been detained at Guantanamo. And
wow.
when I told people that story, they're like, wait, Guantanamo used to, I'm like, yes. So when, you know, I'm like, and you know, I always say, if you want to talk about US immigration reform, you have to center Haitians, because we have carried the brunt of it for generations. And so the first time I read that book, again, it was just like, okay, like, do people see that it doesn't necessarily matter sometimes who's in office, like, this is going to happen and Haitians are going to be the ones who carry it. Like, there is no, reunite these families for us. There are no movements like that for us. We're the ones who've been doing these things for ourselves.
Right. It's like that 44% of, you know, like that 44% didn't appear out of thin air. It's like, it's a result of years and years of very targeted policy towards Haitians that disproportionately affect us. Right. Like my friend who's an immigration lawyer has told me once, oh, if you're Haitian, you sneeze wrong, you get deported.
Yeah, no, yeah. I would encourage everybody to look out for this, the Haitian Women for Haitian Refugees, along with the an NYU Law Clinic is putting a report out soon about that. You go through just what you were saying, Tally, with like this very specific immigration policy that's targeted towards Haiti, and then it goes back, you know, really frames it very, very, very well. So, but to tell you how long this is going, like Haitian Women for Haitian Refugees began with 3 young women, Nina Jaoul, Nicole Payen, and Lily Serra, who had worked as translators on Guantanamo. So this is how far, you know, it goes back. So there are, I mean, I want to like emphasize that there's so many like hardcore people in the community who's been doing the works for so long, but it gets overwhelming with the different waves of immigration, certainly, for sure. So to go back, Sally, yes, that's really one of the things I feel like that's part of, I think what I see as an archival project, because when my uncle died in immigration, they just gave us his corpse and his suitcase. And in the suitcase was a very lengthy immigration interview, where basically anybody who's gone through an immigration interview knows they'll ask you the same question 5 times and hope you lie once or you trip, and then, you know, contradict something you've said. And so that basically was a transcript. And when I saw that, I was like, I have to write this story, because what they gave my uncle a number, it was like he was alien number .. And I was like, no, he was a human being. He was someone who was loved. And that's the case of every, you know, immigration story, every family. And that, I feel like that was very important to document, not just for myself, but also for other people in that same situation.
Sure, absolutely. So I want to, go ahead, Sally.
You're good, go ahead.
So I want to go back to something you said about, you know, you'd go to airports and you would see, children of family friends saying like, don't tell my mother that, I'm about to go enjoy Haiti. And I think so much of what I've come to realize in doing research for this, I discovered like there's this whole section of academics and scholars who study memory. And I was like sending like Tally like all these like reports and books and things. And something that so many of them say is like memory is so unreliable. And I think that's like something you as you grow up and you talk to your siblings and you're like, mommy was so mean about this. And they're like, no, she wasn't. And you're like, did we grow up in the same house? But memory sometimes is so unreliable, and trauma has a way of just like shirking your mind and instilling it for a very long time. And so I think so much of what I hear amongst my friends, amongst people who read Roy, is that Haiti is such a cautionary tale. There's always this thing of like, don't go, don't go, don't go. I mean, I always tell people like, I kind of feel privileged because my mother used to drop me off at Haiti for 3 months out of the year, every year, to the point where she would go to teachers and be like, whatever state test it is, just stick her in a room, give it to her. This American Airlines ticket is not about to be changed.
It's not refundable.
and so I have that relationship with Haiti, but I want to know, like, from your opinion and from your experience, how do we pass on a moving and breathing Haiti to people of Haitian descent? How do we? I mean, it's very hard to say, and I kind of feel weird saying it, given the current state of the country, but how do we give people a Haiti that is not just boogeymen?
With nuance, right? With passion. I think one way in is history, and I see when you're in a room with young people, especially when there are non-Haitians around them, what really excites them is when you start with that history, and without like, just like the making ourselves overly exceptional, which we are, but to be like this history, and they get very proud of that. And I think starting my parents, that's I came to the States in 1981 during I think this is my second pandemic, during the AIDS period where they beat you for being Haitian, where kids denied being Haitian. And then my parents would always like sneak in these little gems, of just like all the things we have to be proud of, right? So I think starting with history, and without, I'm not of the group where it's like, I think sometimes people, they want you to also deny the hardships without denying that. Most of us, and I meet so many young people, don't know our parents passed in Haiti. And the more the trauma, the more traumatic it was, the more silence there is, right? The more like Haitian parents don't really tell why they came here. Some do, but it's very hard to get like the painful stories out of that. Yeah. So I think that for those of us who are interested, but sometimes they get to an age like my parents did, where they would be proud to share now. So I think it's important to get the general stories, share that, and then to learn the stories of the people in our lives who are just as curious about what we've turned into as we are about what they have been, And sometimes I will attend, like you'll attend a funeral, for example, and there's 4 generations. You see the gun, and then you see the 4, like the generation, they seem so unrelated at times, because it's as if everybody picked a lane. So I think we are the living story, right? People, and so I think it would be great, for example, to have like an archive, just kind of like the history projects where someone goes into a booth, like an app where you can ask I think it would be so wonderful to have, because actually we lost a lot of older people in New York. We lost a lot of older Haitians in New York through COVID. And that's a lot of stories, we lost. A lot of younger people didn't know that the Upper West Side of Manhattan was Haitian. And like there were these Haitian men who were on these islands playing dominoes. You get a little bit of that on if you watch like Haitian Corner, like the Raoul Peck film from that. But there's so many, living stories still. So, and there's some great books. There's a new publication, The Haiti Reader, that just takes you from like all these documents throughout Haitian history. But I think starting with history, or what Professor Bello, who was your last guest on this series, called Our Story, and then just like the individual stories, because they're amazing and fascinating. They're stories my parents told me that I will never tell anybody, but I'm glad I know.
So that's very real.
Yes.
Oh man. Yeah. I completely lost what I was about to say.
It's okay. So Tally, I think I should take the next question, because I think question number 6, you were very passionate about that one.
Okay.
So I'm going to give you that gift. So not to get, you can't talk about Haiti without getting political, but we wanted to know, like, what do you think is the role of the diaspora and movements back home? And how do you think this manifests in your art? You wrote that amazing piece for us last year. And, I always look forward to anything you have in the New Yorker, because I know I'm about to learn something, and it's going to create a little fire in me. But what do you think is our role? Because that has been an ongoing conversation for, I think, ever since the Petro-Caribe movement kicked off, where it was either like people are like, I don't know what's going on. My mother says there's always a manifestation la ville, so this is just
they're like, oh, my dad said they're paid, like I got a lot of people
so, but then there are those of us who are like, okay, so how do I support you? Because if I'm saying Black Lives Matter here, I have to be doing something back home too. Like I can't just sit like this. So what do you think is our role through our art, through our mediums? Is it just storytelling? Is there something more that we should do? What would you like to see? I'll just let you run with this one.
I think our role is crucial, but not in the way that we often most advocate for, right? Nous voulons voter, nous voulons passer devant. I think our role is to learn more, about movements on the ground, and then to support people on the ground and what they're doing. And there's a group here, Avancer Ensemble, that does these conversations with young, with millennials primarily, but millennials in Haiti, millennials here. And, just to really, I think information is first. And just as you said, I think people who would be very much involved, if they understood fully the ins and outs, what's at stake, just kind of, you're right, they disengage, just kind of in passing. Even in immigration, I see, like, a lot of the younger people are not, so often when I write those pieces, I write them for my nephews, like, oh what's happening in Haiti now, auntie? It's kind of like, because it's kind of blurs to them. And I think part of what you're doing, like the piece you wrote this week, Val, is also, I can send that along to my, I think you addressed a lot of it in your. I
can't believe you read my.
and I think it's like holding ourselves accountable. And people worry about it. Like, I've been in discussions at panels where they say, there's a generation, like, as we go down the generations, for example, the remittances will go down because people don't know that many people.
Yeah.
Like, my father was like supporting 5 families, his siblings, and then the next, because I know, like, I might be supporting 10, but my daughters may not know it. You know what I mean? It's kind of, so there's the disengagement is part of sometimes not fully grasping the situation. And then people sometimes scold you if you don't say the right thing. I think that's discouraged a lot of young people. It's like, look at you, you're like, politique. And it's like, and you're a political person, you wouldn't say that about Black Lives Matter, you know what I mean? like, I don't want to get involved in that. But there's a point of it where, like, especially if you're on social media a lot, where someone is always squatting you down, right? For being like, you're on the wrong side. And then, so for a lot of young people, they're like, you know, and then if you grew up with parents who grew up under a dictatorship, that for them, they're just like, you know, they're kind of, they have that caution and which they pass on. And then your reservation might be like, you feel like you don't know enough, right? And so I don't think I think part of it is information, and to have those links with, you know, peer groups back in Haiti, and which you can do on a platform like yours, or which others, you know, like other groups are doing, to find out from them, right, what's going on and how we can support them.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. You know, the ways that everything we just said about like ICE and immigration policy, like it's the way everything that's happening in Haiti manifests right here, you know? And I always try to remind people that, like, the reason we're seeing an influx of Haitians right now, you know, at the borders, because like they're fleeing something very specific back home, you know? And so it's like there's this like full circle thing happening where like there is harmful foreign policy here towards Haiti and supporting of dictators and, you know, awful leaders from here back in Haiti, which leads to very real material conditions for your cousins back home, which makes them ask for more money and remittances, right? And it makes them flee. And it's like you understanding what's happening back home helps you understand what's happening here with Haitians, and it helps you show up better for people, for people here and for people there. And so I'm always just trying to help, like, I'm always trying to make that point. I'm like, here's why you should care.
Oh no, and it's so important. And I think on some level, it's not that I think people care, the younger people, but it seemed like unsurmountable in a way. They're like, it's compliqué, you know, that they feel like it's so complicated.
And it is.
It is indeed complicated, and they don't feel versed to fully like express themselves on it. But I think, I mean, again, you know, flatter trop, but I think your work is also important in that, because we need folks who can be like bridges in that way, who can say, you know, who can put it plainly, who can say, this is what's going on. And I think, you know, we have someone like Angie Bell, who's here, does that very well. It's like in her cultural work, and a lot of others who do it, to just be like, you know, this is what's going on. And even, you know, with like explaining the constitutional issues, explaining this referendum, why it shouldn't happen, what, you know, and just like all these things, like to explain, to be like, and you're right. And maybe the way we get people to understand is like, if it's something close to them, and then, like, this is how it could affect you. But your work is important in that sense too, because it's kind of like, okay, it makes that connection. We need those.
Sometimes me and Val are texting, like, we're trying to figure out how to tell this. We're like, we can't make heads or tails of this one. And all the time I'm like, I don't understand Haiti, I'm quitting. All the time.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, imagine, that goes back to that thing we're talking about, permission, but you're working your way through it, right? And then you don't like pronounce yourself on it. You ask different people, or you consult different people until, you know, and then people are free to disagree with you. They're free to say, you know, to say their part, but at least it's not silence. At least there's a conversation around it. And at least we're, you know, and you hope to keep people engaged, because, you know, if this next generation, you know, gets detached, and then, you know, we're going to lose. You know, we talked about losses before. There's a loss in that as well.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay. I do see it's 8:00, but I do want to ask my question.
I had to buy a book because the moment she started forming the question, she's like, "Did you read this book?" And I'm like, "It's on my to-do list." And next thing I know, I'm on,
Wow.
It was that Ocean Vuong quote I was really excited
Oh
about.
yeah, I was like, what is it? It's a beautiful book. I'm forgetting the
On Earth,
title.
we
On Earth, yes. I love
the book, and I kept having I was like, throughout the day, like, oh my god.
Yeah, he's a poet, so it's like that language just sings.
Yeah.
I love the cross readings.
It took me back to Haiti, like it took me back to like the way Gamun Pale,
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm thinking about how in like political movements in Haiti, how a lot of times like it's artists at the forefront, like you look at like the founder of the Haitian Communist Party, it's like poets and musicians. And the other day, my brother did a fundraiser recital for Bloom Haiti, right? And it was featuring all Haitian composers because my brother's a singer, and him and his friends got together. And I was doing the composer bios for him. And basically every bio was like, he was also mayor of blah, blah, blah. Haiti at one point. And it was just like, and it's so interesting to me, the role of the artist. I'm on a tangent. So
just keep going, because someone in the audience said, please keep going.
Someone is like, no, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay. No, I wanted to say, they talk about a lot, and you talk about a lot, how under Duvalier, under repressive regimes, the ways that artists found ways to talk about what was going on through art, right? Like putting on Antigone, to say something about a tyrant, or, like metaphor, the role of metaphor. And that's why I got excited about this Ocean Vuong quote when I read it. And I'll read it right now. He says, Vietnamese refugees, for example, use metaphor as a coping mechanism. Metaphor provides a way to talk about trauma without stating the experience outright. An abortion is described as having papaya seeds scraped out of you. Likewise, when Abel Meeropol wrote the poem Strange Fruit about the lynching of African Americans in the South, he was not reaching for the romantic sublime, but to render the horrific via an alternative speech act. The metaphor in the mouths of survivors becomes a way to innovate around pain. So I'm just thinking a lot about metaphor and how, like, in Haiti, we have so many beautiful ways of naming like anything, How you say, ma badlo pou m'febe, glass.
Yeah. Lave messieurs à terre, which is like
lave messieurs à terre. But like when you think about like those are really painful conditions to be describing, but you say it in such this like poetic way, and it's no longer as painful, or it kind of allows us to talk about it in a way that like doesn't make us catch our breath, And I wonder about this role of metaphor, because I try very hard to write my songs in Creole. It's like a challenge I have for myself. I'm like, I'm gonna sing in Creole,
And you do beautifully.
Thank you. I wonder about this role of metaphor, and I wonder if is this a Creole thing, or is this something we have like in our culture at Haiti? Like, how do you manage to bring it to your art, and when you write in English? Yeah.
Well, I think of like carnival songs, right? Like the voix point, the level of voix point that's in some songs. When I was a kid in Haiti and I was like mad at a friend, like I would sing like some voix point song.
That's great.
And so like there's an element to that, to carnival, where like political messages are sometimes very clearly sent, sometimes metaphorically sent. So there's, so I think Proverbs are like that, where it's like, it's like, I feel like that captures that whole thing of like, if you say it's like, I threw the water, but I didn't wet it. Like, it's kind of like, you take it as you will.
Yeah.
And I feel there's a very poetic and artistic and political element to that, to find ways, and maybe it's something that was like a fine-tuned during the dictatorship. And that's why I wrote Create Dangerously, because I wanted to delve into like how people do that, you know, who with like Frank Fauché, who translated Oedipus Rex, and Félix Maurice Leroy, who translated Antigone. And Antigone is about a woman whose brother is left dead on the street, and she can't pick him up because that would implicate her as a traitor. And so the whole play is about, you know, that. And then, and Félix Maurice Leroy, who translates that in Creole, I think is one of the first plays, and people would perform it. And it was still commenting on the dictatorship and the fact that sometimes, you know, bodies were left out as as examples, just like the Americans did, you know, with Charles Malpeal, but that it's still, you know, like art, like the art can be symbolic in that way, that there was always some kind of protest behind the art. And even the stories were told, you know, like the folk tales. There's an element of resistance, you know, like that little girl like chantait Tis orange grandi, grandi. There's joy, but I always felt like in the things we were told, and like I was told when I was growing up, or the things that I witnessed in the culture of red, I always felt like there was no accident of anything, right? It's like Marie Vieux-Chauvet, who had this group of writers she belonged to called this like Spiders of the Night. I'm forgetting how to say spiders in French, but it was like there. And in her novels, there was all this, you know, these ways around, and that almost got her, you know, that got her book banned from Haiti for sure. But there was, you know, there was always, I think, artists felt like they had to engage in some way with what was happening around them. So, and they passed, and going through so many, you know, they passed in this book that was just translated by Kayama Glover called Adiana de Tumerev, which is one of his most famous books. There's a woman who's mistaken for Simbi Lassus, who's like, I think you know, it's like a migrant. She's going to Jamaica on a boat. And you can read that as, you know, you can read that in a spiritual sense, you can read that in a migration sense, you can read that on like from a feminist lens. You know, we have a really, really rich, and that's why I've always tried to work on translations and these anthologies to try, because we have such a rich literary culture, past, present, future, in country, out country, that I would also love to see our young people delve into, because we have an extraordinary literary legacy. And I said past, present, future. Yeah.
Okay.
So I have one question from a diehard fan who just DM'd me, and I really want to ask this. Is it okay?
Sure.
She says, Val, if you see this, I have a question for Edwidge. A lot of older Haitian literature is written in French, which makes it feel like the diaspora, who are monolingual in English, is limited from our history. Can you please talk about the importance of translation of our older Haitian texts to keep the stories alive of our elders?
Oh, that is so important, and it's been happening. So when I did this anthology called Haiti Noir and Haiti Noir 2, and Haiti Noir has more contemporary Haitian writers. It gives you a sample. So you know, one of the questions I think you guys had asked was like, what are my favorite writers? Between those two books, you'll find all my favorite writers, and, you know, excluding some new ones that weren't around yet. But I think, so go get Haiti Noir and Haiti Noir 2. And a lot of those writers have since been translated, like Evelyn Touillot, Rosalie, the infamous Rosalie, Yannick Lyons, his books have been translated. I'm reading now Louis-Philippe d'Alembert, who wrote a novel about the Mediterranean that's been translated. There's more and more translation. Again, Despeste, who goes back, you know, Adiana de Tumerev. Kayama Glover also translated Marie Vieux-Chauvet, who I think everybody talks about, you know, L'amour, colère, folie, it's a book I love, but like Dancing on the Volcano is like a masterpiece. Yeah. I worked many, many years ago with Carol Coates on a translation of Jacques-Stéphane Alexis' And the Flicker of an Eyelid, L'Espace de Ciment. And everybody knows Alexis for Génial Compère Soleil, General Sun, My Brother. It's translated.
I just got it.
To
Okay.
Masters of the Dew is Jacques Romain's translated. Masters of the Dew, Jacques Romain's book was translated by Langston Hughes and Mercer Cook. So there are some translations out there.
That's listicle. We got to make it, Val.
Yeah, make it definitely, because they exist. You know, Gigi Dominique, Memoirs of an Amnesiac, and also if you haven't read the translations of the Dany Laferrière, like they're wonderful too. You know, Tuyos translated. You definitely have many more translations of sort of both older writers and contemporary. Like Marie-Vieux Chauvet's Amour Colère was in the Modern Library. It's like, so that's a pretty big deal. Yeah. So they are out there, and there are more coming, because I know people who are translating, and it's that was always in my mind, because I wanted my nieces and nephews to be able to read. You know, they're monolingual. You know, they speak Creole, but they may not read a whole novel in Creole or in French. So for me, that was always important to have that, you know, that continuity to the translations. But there are quite a few. Caitlin Morris is translated. César Sauvage is, you know, so there are a lot. There's quite a few.
And Desafi was just translated recently.
Yes, which is a marvel, because it's a very and you know, it's in Creole, but with invented words in Creole. Yeah. It's quite a translation too. So, but you see how far, and I went back to the Marcelin brothers, Toby Marcelin, his brother, who wrote these novels that were translated way back then, you know, and with an introduction by Edmund Wilson, which is a very famous critic. And I have this book of Creole poetry that was translated by this woman who was in Haiti. So there was always that effort, but I think now, you know, there could be more, and there's new books like Les Immortels, who was just translated by Nathan Dees. So I'm going on too long, but we can make a course. I feel like there could be a class on translated Haitian literature for the next generation. Yeah.
Edwidge, I want to thank you for being here. You know, we made a list of the dreams of people we would want to have on here, and then you called me. You were like, "What if we did a white chat?" And I was like,
I know we flipped out that day. I was just like, I'm walking on air.
Not because I had watched your other one. I was like, this is nice. I want to be I want to do one. This is fun.
I will never, I don't think I'll ever stop fangirling.
Never.
We are so grateful to be in community with you and to just experience your art in real time, and just know that you're as cool as your art suggests. And thank you for the work that you do. And, you know, part of what we do to keep Haiti alive for people is because we read your books, you know? And we're happy you came here tonight. And I don't know.
Yeah, no,
words.
No, I definitely want to say I'm sure you know you are loved, but you are loved. People who, you know, don't know anything about Haiti love you. When I told some of my coworkers I was doing this tonight, they were like, so can we send questions? Can we?
Yeah, I posted on my Instagram and my coworker was like, hold on.
Wait, so is she are you gonna be talking to her direct? They were just fangirling for hours. They would go do work, go into a meeting, and then come back and be like, so about tonight. So you are so loved, and you've inspired so many of us to just find different ways to tell our stories and to not be ashamed, and to find community with one another. And I will definitely say you should go through the comments section once we log off, because there are a lot of people saying they love you right now. But no, honestly, thank you. Thank you for, you know, just devoting yourself to telling our stories and giving us a voice and giving little Haitian Black girls someone who sees them, because I think that is super important.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to both of you. Merci en pile tout le monde dans chat là, and who were watching. I think the most important thing that we are doing, that you continue to do, that we should continue, is this idea of being in community, right? I think it's that is, you know, for me, who when I came here, there was no war, there was no, you know, it was just there was an isolation to it, right? So use the community that we do have, and I think, and use it to build one another up, you know. So I think that's very, very important. You know, Cornel West is like, critique is love manifested a different way, but let's use that, you know, that productively, and just like be in community, because sometimes we're all we have.
Yeah.
And I think you've done a, you know, Roy, you've done a really wonderful job with that. And I'm so, you know, I'm like old enough now that some people call me auntie, some nicely, some not so nicely, but as an auntie now, as an elder, I just, you know, I also want to say that I'm very proud of you and what you're doing. And I think it's so very important to keep that conversation going across the generations, to keep bridging those gaps with here and with Haiti, and to just have these chats, you know, to find these moments where we can be in community with one another. So I was very honored to be here, and I thank you for having me. You know, keep up the good work. Chapeau bas, Kimbila.
Merci.
Thank you everyone for watching. Follow Woy. Night.
Bye, guys.